like to take the opportunity today to talk with friends of ours. Samantha is a new friend of ours. I've learned that she probably prefers Sam as a name, so I'm going to feather that in, and we're going to work our way into me assuming that we're closer and closer friends by doing that. And then there is Susan Zork, who's been blessing our congregation, our worship over the years in such critical and pivotal ways. And you know Delcy Kuhlman as well, who's been a key member of our worship community and contributing through a wide range of creative ways. These are all women in ministry. Different stages of ministry, different points of ministry, come from different parts of the country, so forth. And I just thought, I'd like to try to enter into your world a little bit of ministry, because we can talk about it. Susan and I, we're in the same meetings often, and we're talking about the same stuff, and it dawns on me that there's much I just don't know. And so I thought maybe we would start with a couple of things. One, for each of you, when did you start thinking a life of ministry as a calling, not just the way any Christian should think of ministry, but special, possibly set aside ministry? When did you start thinking about that as a possibility?
Any of us?
Yeah.
Okay, it's a long story, so I can't do it. But when I was about 8, and I was walking in the woods, and I saw a stump leaning over about like that, and I thought, hey, that looks like a pulpit. And I went back and got a book and a Bible and went out and preached a sermon there. Same sermon for about 2 weeks. There'll be tons of squirrels in heaven because of it, I know. And then I forgot about it for about 20, 30 years until I went to grad school.
Huh.
And I didn't know what I should do. And that story came to mind, and I said, are you kidding me?
Huh.
Are you kidding me? And so I went into ministry.
Delcy.
I was home raising kids, but I had wanted to be a doctor, and the closest my life could ever get to that would be to be a hospital chaplain. I thought that would be wonderful, and it took a long time trying, and finally where I was accepted into some chaplain training. When I finished, I found it was before the medical system started changing, and I found no one would even let me volunteer. I had no education. And my supervisor was brash enough to say, why don't you go to seminary? Well, that's another whole story, but God opened the doors. The thing that seminary did to me was it started growing a pastor heart. But I live in Michigan.
You're saying that pastors suffer under the cold, is what you're referring to. No, anyway, sorry.
No, it's just not possible in Michigan.
Sam? Let's give that another try. It might even be me. I don't know when I turn my head. How are we doing? Go ahead.
Okay, there you go. So for me, I was also pretty young, probably about 6 years old. And it's a little similar to Susan's story. I had seen a woman pastor for the first time, and I came home, and I grabbed a Bible, and I started preaching to my stuffed animals. But the funny thing was, I had a towel turban on my head. And when my parents came in, they asked, why are you wearing that? And I said it's because I saw Pastor Hyveth Williams preach. And every time she preached back then, she always wore a hat. So I thought that when women preach, they have to wear hats. So I put a towel on my head so that when I was preaching, it was correct. And then over time, through high school, I really sensed that God was kind of calling me to consider this, but it was the last thing that I wanted for so many reasons. My parents were so involved in the church. We were there 4 or 5 times a week. I felt like everyone was always looking at me. And I knew if I became a pastor, it would be the exact same thing. So it was a long journey, a long story of many different ways that God confirmed. But I would say that it came to me really young as well.
Sam, did you ever have somebody, like what happened to me, somebody come up to you and say, Sam, I think God's called, as a child or a teenager, after you'd started to sense this, I think God's calling you to ministry?
Yes, and it was the most annoying thing ever because I did not want that. So there were 2 things I always said. I would never be a pastor. Not that Filipinos do that anyway. No one's having this conversation in Filipino churches where I grew up. So it's not that Filipinos ever thought that women could be pastors where I grew up. But I said I'd never be a pastor, and I would never marry a pastor. And I became a pastor, and I married a pastor. So,
Sometimes I think God just says, okay.
yeah. So yes, people were telling me that all the time. It was very irritating all through high school.
Interesting. Were they your contemporaries, or were they your, who?
They were both. They were friends, and they were teachers, pastors. And it's not that I was asking them. It was actually something that I asked from God, because I know that God confirms spiritual gifts through community. And so I figured then people should tell me. And I think, though some people in authority, I would say, or that were my teachers, pastors, said that, the ones that meant the most to me were my friends who either were struggling in faith or were not believers, and they would come to church if I was involved in something, and they would come and talk to me about God and ask me to pray with them. And that was significant, because it was people who wouldn't necessarily want that.
So it is a natural response to your gifts. Susan, how'd that go?
Absolutely not. No one encouraged me. No one told me they thought they saw that in my future. But I know this is hard to believe, but I grew up in another time than you. And I grew up in a conservative area of the country, and women were not pastors. Women didn't even collect the offering. It was considered inappropriate. So that's why I was so shocked when that little story came back to me, sitting in the parking lot over here, outside of the library. And I think, I had absolutely no inkling of being a pastor, because I'd never even seen that as a possibility. And, I always loved Jesus, and people like that, and, I did a lot of singing and all those kinds of things, but no one ever said to me, you should go into ministry. It just wasn't part of the picture.
When I'm picking up Delcy, that is kind of in the combination of being encouraged to go to the seminary. Was there any encouragement earlier than that?
No.
Okay.
And even in seminary, at that time, 350 students and 3 of us women?
Well, let me transition then. Did any of you have somebody tell you probably, even well-meaning, not critical, you probably shouldn't go into ministry?
The only time I ever experienced anything like that was when in a class I made the remark that if we don't learn to follow our conscience and live that, then we may have to leave pastoral ministry in order to follow our conscience. And I didn't hear the remark. It came to me later. I walked out of the room, and one man says, yes, she has a husband to support her. And I did. And he supported me in so many ways.
Anybody else have somebody say, kind of the opposite of the encouragement?
Kind of. I grew up as a hippie, a very good one, and I was a singer, songwriter, played the guitar, and I always did my Christian experience and expression through that kind of thing. And one time I was lured into singing for ministerial meetings, and I didn't know at the time that I was being set up to have a discussion about the validity or not of my type of music. So I went and I sang a song that I wrote about me and my experience with Jesus. And I asked my boyfriend at the time to come and play bass. His name was Steve, that was it. And and I sang this song, a very vulnerable song about I'm a poor and lonely sinner. And as I was walking off the stage, a minister stood up and said, that is the most disgusting and inappropriate thing I've ever heard. And I turned 10 shades of red. It's just embarrassing.
Sure.
I wasn't angry. I felt like an idiot. And that was you remember, don't you, baby? Yeah, no, it was a big bunch of ministers. And they felt comfortable enough to criticize my experience with Jesus and my way of expressing it.
As a public
It was a
point
little
and
bit to get
metaphor.
over.
Yeah, wow.
I would say for me, I think the reason why I needed so much encouragement of people telling me I should do it was because I grew up in a culture that women just didn't do that. I didn't see women on the stage. I didn't see women preaching except for in other churches that we visited, maybe once or twice. And my grandfather was a pastor in the Philippines, which is a lot more conservative than really anywhere here in the U.S. So I just wanted to go watch Lilo and Stitch at the movies and be able to wear jewelry. I mean, these are like the battles that we had. We weren't talking about women in ministry, so it was a conservative environment. And anytime I would mention it or someone would mention it to me, there would always be one or two people to say, no, we don't do that. That doesn't happen. Don't you think that God's calling you to be a teacher instead? Maybe he's calling you to be a Bible worker, but he can't be calling you to be a pastor because God doesn't call women to do that. So I heard kind of both sides of the equation.
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, in my experience, I never had anybody say anything remotely like that to me about, no, not you. Well, we know that the current conversation really isn't about whether or not women should be in ministry. It's a little different than that, which is kind of interesting. So we just have kind of journeyed a little bit with you. But so let's calibrate for a second. Just raise of hand, how many of you are commissioned at this point in your profession? Okay. And it bears asking, is anybody here ordained? As an elder? You know, fascinatingly, back in 1987, when I first interned, I went into a church district, 2 churches, and one of them had about 8 people that attended every week, and the head elder was a woman. And they were very quick to make sure that I realized that that was because they didn't have anyone else. And I found that just terribly ironic and weird and harsh, and it's either okay or it's not okay, and the disclaimer was just very uncomfortable to me. And this woman was, she was a rock in terms of her ability to lead that church. It was amazing. So that's fascinating. So wait, how many of you are elders, ordained elders? Okay, so you're all ordained elders. I'm going to try not to veer off on that tangent because, interestingly, the Bible doesn't really say, well, this kind of ordination, but not that kind of ordination, does it? So let me ask you this question. What's the difference to you between being ordained in ministry, not the elder type, versus being commissioned? And maybe Susan, could you speak to what you see the difference to be?
Okay, I want to preface my response with 2 things. First of all, I have very strong opinions, and I know it. But the other side of me is that I'm not ever convinced that people should necessarily hear them. I hold my cards kind of close. So I've been worried. I know some of you in my class think you do not, but I do. Personal opinion. I can claim the gospel all the time. The second thing that I want to tell you, and I've thought so much about this when you asked us this opinion, panel thing, is my very first class in ministry was from the dear saint and precious man, John Youngberg. And he said in that first class, and I've never forgotten it, primarily, above all else, the job of a minister is to affirm the faith in somebody else. And when you ask me questions that I have strong feelings about, and they're not necessarily nice, I'm honestly very hesitant to speak. Because I don't want to ruin anybody's faith. I don't want to call into question the little bit of the great things that you hang on to in the church and in the gospel and in the person of Jesus Christ. I'm very apprehensive about this whole thing from that perspective, okay? Having said that.
Brace for impact. Brace for...
No. It's just, I wanted to get it out there. The difference between ordination and commissioning, as I see it in my vocation and in the blessed church that I work for, is a matter of male headship and what I can and can't do as a leader. I asked for commissioning, and I got it because I had people that wanted me to marry them and give Bible studies to them. And I'm an old girl. I've been around for a long time and doing this stuff for a long time, and I'm not worried about me, frankly. I'm not. I'm worried sick about the young women that are coming up after me. But I'm going to hang in there. What are they going to do to me? Fire me? I'll still keep talking. I'll still keep doing it.
That'd be ironic if Dr. Luxton chose to
Yeah,
fire
well,
you.
I don't think she will. But But who knows what's coming down the pike? I don't know. But I'm not
True.
worried about me, and I'm commissioned. And it allows me to do the things that I know I'm called to do. But the difference between ordination and commissioning is a sexist issue. It has nothing to do with ministry because we all do the same thing. And we're actually allowed to do the same thing. So what's the difference? The difference is no woman better be in charge of a man. We better keep that carefully separated. There's no other rationale in my head, and there's no other rationale in my experience either. And where my counterparts are ordained and seen as ministers of the gospel for the church of Christ, and it's there until you do something awful. Every couple of years, I got to reapply and see if I'm still worthy to even do the jobs that I'm asked to do. There's some problems here, but don't let it hurt your faith, please, because it's not hurting mine. It's not hurting mine. I still believe.
And I just want to trigger off of that because you and I have had this conversation a little bit behind the scenes, and there's a deep worry because we want this conversation to be ours, that we grow from and through, and that we figure out how to raise our voice together. And the last thing I think, Susan, what you're saying is the last thing we can afford or want is that, say, young voices who do not understand why this is even a conversation would leave Susan to fight this by herself. I'm just begging of you. See this conversation as our invitation to a place of honesty, not even an invitation for you to agree with us or agree with anyone, but to open your heart to experience what it is to rush through a mall with everything rushing at you when that's not been your experience, because you've not engaged in ministry, because you've not felt called to ministry, because you're a man, because whatever. Stop for a minute and think about what's being said here, because if as a man in ministry, if your experience, you are allowed, invited, encouraged, employed, but the way you're treated just on the subject of how you have to reapply, and just that difference alone, even if we're just saying, well, commissioned is just the female word for ordination. It's not, and one of the ways you can tell is because certain positions in our church of leadership you have to be ordained for. If you were commissioned, you could not hold that position. And they are positions of leadership. It's interesting to me that we have not chosen as a university to make that a condition, but it is the equivalent in most all of our other church structures.
But our university is a general conference institution.
That's true, and there could be ramifications of that. Well, let me ask you this, Sam. You look like you're dying to say something. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask you a question. You can go backwards, forwards, however you want to do it. So, is the current church's conversation about this, is it a big deal to you?
That is actually probably not as straightforward of an answer as it might seem. On one hand, yes, and on the other hand, no. When the whole San Antonio vote happened, I was at Six Flags Magic Mountain with my youth group, and they heard about it. And a couple parents were there, and they were talking to me. They wanted to comfort me. And I remember looking at them and realizing, I looked at all my teens. The next day, they were going to be at my house for Vespers. The next day, we had all these things planned. And I realized it changed nothing. It changed nothing about my ministry. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. Specifically for the women who come before me, who have been ministering for so long, and a level that's not equal. Because even though people say it's just about ordination versus commission, I will say, at least in my limited experience, the people that I've come across are not saying that, oh, well, women can do everything. They should be pastors, just not be ordained. Really, behind it, a lot of what I hear is the same stuff that Susan hears. It's about authority and headship. Women can preach because, we've had women, Ellen White preached in our church, but they can't be in charge as long as they're not in charge. I've even heard people tell me, you can be a pastor as long as you're not a senior pastor. And I remember thinking, when you come to talk about leadership positions, my conference, Southeastern California Conference, was the very first conference that voted a woman president. And I remember sitting there. I was there for that vote. I had just become a pastor. And I remember watching our general conference president broadcast to us where we were, asking us not to vote a woman as president because only an ordained minister can serve as president. And our president, Pastor Sandy Roberts, is an amazing, godly, spirit-filled, gifted woman. And I remember just sitting there thinking that, you know what, it's not just words. It does matter. There is a significant and marked difference between ordination and commissioning if my president, who is gifted to do this, and we all affirm that, can't do it because of her gender. So for those reasons, it does matter to me.
I've had privilege in the not-too-distant past to be witness to the way Sandy Roberts is dealing with issues in her conference, and she reminds me of Jesus.
Well, it's interesting because I teach leadership, and there's a lot of interesting data on leadership and women. What we know about in high-level teams and high-level team performance, teams perform better if the more women there are on the team, up to 50%. They perform better. Interesting. There are a variety of other dynamics and data points that are fascinating in the area, and the world certainly is appreciating this. That women and leadership, it's not a kind of a bad compromise somehow that we just kind of got to get over. It's actually an advantage the sooner you get to that place, and that's kind of fascinating to consider.
If Jesus were here today walking on the earth, and there were women authors as there are today, I think Scripture would have given had a lot more to say about the women who walked with him and served with him. We don't even think about that.
Yeah, and I think that's a challenging thought to some of us who might think that, I have a problem with this idea because what you're making it seems there's no difference between men and women, and but I hear clearly what you're saying, and I think that's a fascinating thing, and it's also fascinating that God included writers in Scripture that would have all kinds of reasons we might have disqualified them, whether they were a murderer, for instance, or whatever else, right?
And Scripture was written in a time, in a setting that would not have listened to anything about the female issue. And it had to be understood then, but then we have to understand it.
So tell me what you say about whatever version of this comment that you hear. And do you even say anything, or do you just feel something inside? When somebody comes out with some version of, why won't these women kind of just calm down? Why?
Because we're hysterical women and we can't.
Why do you have to have this?
Okay, what I perhaps resent, and that's a very strong word and I hate to say it the most, is who wants to have to come to their own defense? Nobody does. Everyone hates to be put in the position where I have to defend myself. I have to speak on my behalf and the legitimacy of who I am or what I'm called to do. And what I think is fundamental in this issue is that very thing, that it puts half of the church in a defensive mode where we feel that we have to defend our call to serve Jesus Christ. And in some sense, other than the fact that I got to tell people, nope, my church, see, once I get started, this is not good. Honestly, I feel bad. When I have to tell people, my siblings, for crying out loud, who aren't in the church, no, the church doesn't treat women and men exactly the same. That bothers me, just as a matter of how do I defend that to people that doesn't make any sense at all. And why would we put a whole half of our segment, more than half, because there are more women for whatever reason than men, put them in a position where they have to defend their convictions, where they have to defend who they are in the sight of God and what they've been called to do. That bottom line premise thought is completely avoidable and such a shame.
And it puts us in a position that Jesus refused to be in. He would not defend himself.
Well, I think, and I was thinking about this with regard to issues of other issues of prejudice, that if people who are in positions of power in this conversation, men who are, especially those who are ordained, if they don't choose to speak up about what they truly believe conscientiously, I wouldn't want anybody to speak up about what they don't believe, but if they choose not to, so now I've singled myself out, if they don't step up in this situation, then you're forcing those who are under some point of control to rise up to bloody revolution, right? And it could be that stuff happens. But this is, I think, well, so Sam, did you have a reaction to that? Because I'm very curious about somebody at the beginning of their ministry, because you've been hearing this kind of stuff, right? And so, what does that make you feel? How do you deal with that? How do you process that?
I think it's a common thing for people to say, well, why do you need that, right? And again, it's kind of two sides. I don't need it to know that God has called me. I don't think any of us do. We don't need someone to give us a piece of paper to know that God has called us. But I think the challenge still goes to the heart of it. If there was a way that our church truly did recognize and affirm the calling of women pastors, and it was true and there was not that question, it's more, I guess what I'm trying to say is more than just an issue of semantics. There really is thoughts and feelings, and they're not the same behind the idea, and they usually come to the point of saying it's not equal. Your gender makes you not equal. And I think we know that separate but equal doesn't work. And there's something about knowing that God has called me to do something, but my church doesn't recognize that essentially makes me feel like they're saying that I'm wrong, that there's something wrong with me. That if God has called you to do it, but we don't recognize it, there's something wrong with you, that you sense that and you live that out and you feel that inside. So I think it's just a feeling of not having a place. I don't belong. Even when I'm there, there's always a question of what are people, like what are they really thinking and feeling towards the fact that I'm operating in this position. It's okay in the sense that it doesn't change my relationship with God or my calling, but it's uncomfortable to always live with that awareness.
So I've got 2 more questions in 1 minute.
Ooh.
So, first question. We probably won't be able to have everybody, but I'm curious about somebody responding to this. When you pray about this, what do you say to God?
I do pray about it. And I just say, you know what's going on. I trust you. I know you. I trust you. And help me be kind and help me be civil and help me always treat people like Jesus treats them.
So, final question. Go ahead. Were you going to say something, Sam? I'm curious now.
I think it's important to be able to say that I'm not trying to push to be a pastor all the time. So when I pray, I ask God, whatever you want, I'll do. The minute that you say this is not your calling for me, I'll do something else. So whatever it is that you want is what I want, whether it's to be a pastor or not. It's whatever you want, not God, help this to work out in my favor.
I sort of resonate with that as well. It's not really about me, but I am responsible to many young women in my department that come through and have the calling to pastoral ministry. And I do pray for them and our church that there'll be a resolve that can make them feel, number one, comfortable staying in the church, and number two, even serving in the church in these kinds of capacities.
All right, so last question, and just sadly, I'm gonna pick on Sam for this, because you are stepping into the deep footprints of these women, right? So here's my question for you. What about this topic are you hopeful about? What is hopeful? Because as you've heard Susan say, we've got to get to the place where we are attractive to our young people in the postures we take on who Jesus is. What is hopeful?
I think one thing that I'm really hopeful about for for women coming into ministry such as myself is for us to recognize that we're part of a great journey and a great story, and that we are where we are because of the women that have come before us that have paved the path. So to recognize that we're part of a journey instead of just individuals. But for our church, and especially for my peers, those who are in my same age group, I'm hopeful that this conversation will help call people to a decision. I think there's a lot of kind of turmoil about what will happen with millennials and with young people when it comes to this, but I think as I look through Scripture, Jesus always called people to decide something. And a lot of times people only decided when they had to, when they came against something and had to make a choice. And I think that things that the enemy designs for evil, God can use for good. And so I'm hopeful for that, that as people are examining their faith, that God is going to keep his promise and the Spirit will come and lead and grow people to a deeper relationship with God instead of further away. That's my hope for it.
As we walk off, if you would like to say thank you to God for the women he has brought into your life to minister to you, whether it's one of these or any other, then I just invite you to say thank you to God through the form of applause that's to him and no one else as we continue journeying this Sabbath. The feeling in the room, the sense of empathy for something that we don't experience life and the world like that. And it made me think of today, and it made me think of right now, and the opportunity we were going to get to pick up our conversation from last week, where Pastor Denis and Jay led us through an interesting conversation about what is going on in the Adventist world conversation around women in ministry and leadership of church and unity. And I found myself thinking, okay, I'm going to sit up here, the guy, and ask some questions of these good friends of mine. And it centered me a little bit, this video clip, that in a way that I would like to invite you to consider. And that is, what does the world look like from somebody else's eyes? What do these women experience that I don't? And that maybe you don't. Of course, we all experience different things than one another, but there are some maybe even categorical things that I'd like to know more about. And so what we'd like to do today in this conversation about what's going on with women in ministry, commissioning, ordination, unity, commands and policies, what I'd like to invite you to do just for these next few minutes is join me in kind of asking some questions to listen to the perspective and understand what it seems like to walk into the kind of the mall of their ministry world. So, first question I have for you. And we did this before, but if they know me, they know I'm probably not going to do it the same way twice. So I'm going to start with a completely different question, and I'm curious if anybody who would be willing to answer this question. What about this conversation right now frightens you?
The question of ordination for women, what that frightens me? It frightens me because of the reality that we already have a exodus in our church of disenfranchised people, and particularly millennials and young people. This is not hearsay, this is real. You may have seen our North American president make an impassioned plea this week on a video, saying to the church, I've never seen this in my life, I'm not going to tell you how old I am, please don't leave. That was his line. I think this kind of thing is an invitation to leave, justifiably in the minds of some people. It scares me because we need the church. As imperfect as it is, we need the church. Jesus established a church. We need the church. It needs to be different, but we need the church. And this is just an invitation to go someplace else.
What frightens me is reading in the Gospels and looking at the Pharisees and Jesus and the church, and I get scared. And I don't know, I want to be like Jesus. I want to be non-defensive. I want to love everybody, including my enemies. But it seems like it's a done deal when I look at he just had to come out and say, woe unto you.
I think the thing that frightens me in this conversation is who we're becoming as we're having this conversation. Because I know for me, the more things that I hear, and I try not to read online too much in the comments, etc., and I try not to engage in arguments and things like that, because I realize that it's so easy for my heart to become hard and for me to become angry. And I think it's true of people wherever you find yourself in the conversation. And it's so hard to remember sometimes that God cares more about who we're becoming. And if I don't hold myself consciously in a posture of just surrender to God and trusting that he's going to take care of it, I can easily find myself becoming someone that I don't want to be and doesn't reflect Jesus. And I think that's the thing that concerns me the most on all sides of it, is who we're becoming while we're having this conversation.
Yeah, interesting. And back to Susan's initial comment, I find it fascinating that some of my young friends, especially my younger friends, that are on the fringe, that don't know much of anything else about what's going on right now, don't know anything about hope trending or anything, but they know about this. And wow, that sets you back. That sets me back a bit. Well, so these are my friends, your friends, Delcy Kuhlman, who's been involved in one place for a good long time, helping often behind the scenes. With her creative mind and input and interest in worship here. And of course, Pastor Susan Zork, who is one of our pastoral team and a huge core contributor to the ministry here. And this is a new friend of ours who has come to the seminary, Samantha, Sam, who is in her first year of seminary experience, right? Pursuing an MDiv, sponsored by a conference, one of the conferences kind of in question with regard to how we're going to pursue unity here, right? Again, I'm not so much interested in pursuing the theological explanation for this or that. I really want to hear from your hearts. And one of the questions that we asked before, I'm curious about you sharing with this group, is when you first really suspected maybe God's calling you to formal ministry. Can you talk about that for a second?
Okay, I told this story in first service a little bit. It happened when I was about 8 years old, unbeknownst to me. I used to walk in the woods alone. I grew up in the state of Maine, really lovely. I wasn't afraid of bears and tigers and whatever else they might be there. I don't know, I'd walk by myself.
Were there tigers spotted in your woods?
Back in the day. And I was out walking in the woods one time, and I saw a tree that had fallen over, and someone had come by with a chainsaw and kind of cut it off so it wouldn't fall on people, and I thought, hey, that looks like a pulpit. And I took my little fat legs and ran back to the house and found my Bible and a copy of Messages to Young People, I remember now, and went up there and just preached a storm. Just preached out a storm. And I went back day after day. For a week or two. It was just something that I did every day. It's really cool because I know that there will be many rabbits and squirrels in heaven for the sermon that I preached. Then I kind of got sideways, do other things, whatever. But many, many years later, 25 years later, I'm sitting in the parking lot trying to decide what major to apply for my graduate work. And I'm praying because I'm filling out the form. And I don't know which way to go. And that story, I hadn't thought about it in 20 years. And that story immediately came to my mind of me as a little girl preaching. And I honestly said to God, are you kidding me? That's what you want me to do? I had no women pastors growing up. Women were not allowed to collect the offering. It was wrong to collect the offering. That thought came out of an absolute void of any reason why I would think, other than I love Jesus. I've always loved Jesus. That I admit freely. But it happened when I was 8, long before I knew it was happening. It's really sweet, actually. Makes me feel good.
Love to hear some of those squirrel sermons, yeah.
I only had one.
Yeah. Hey. Refine that message.
I spent a lot of years home taking care of kids, and I had loved medicine, So I knew I wouldn't be a doctor, but if I could minister in a hospital, then I could have the best of both worlds. And finally got into some CPE training and decided that's really what I was made for.
CPE, chaplaincy.
Yeah, but then I couldn't even volunteer as a chaplain because I didn't have the appropriate educational background. And my supervisor says, "Why don't you go to seminary?" Well, I'd never thought of such. But God opened those doors and I went. And the more time I spent there, the more I knew that I wanted to share the God I was coming to know. And chaplaincy was okay for a time, but you just have a little tiny bit of time with people, and it takes time to build trust and build faith. And I needed to be a pastor, but I live in Michigan.
Sam.
I think for me, I was really young too, like Susan, 6 or 7 years old, when I first started also pretending to preach with a turban on my head because the only woman pastor I had ever seen always wore these hats or turbans when she preached. But I put that aside quickly because what I really wanted to do was be a lawyer. So all through high school, I was really struggling between this call to ministry that I felt that God had for me and wanting to go to law school, wanting to go to do my undergrad at UCSD, University of California, San Diego, study political science pre-law, and go to law school. So I set up all of these things I thought was impossible for God to achieve in order to confirm to me he wanted me to go into ministry. And I'm talking miracle after miracle in the terms even of over $100,000 of his provision and these things that he did. And it was just 3 days before my high school graduation that I realized I had to make a decision. I was accepted into UCSD, into political science pre-law, and then PUC had created this completely new scholarship and given it to me, and I had to decide whether or not I was going to follow God in this decision. So I went to PUC, but I took a pre-law degree and theology, just in case God changed his mind, and just decided to follow him in there. Did 3 years of pastoral ministry, and now I'm here.
Now, in the first conversation that we had, I asked the question of how many of you have had somebody in your life, when knowing that you're going to pursue ministry, seek to discourage you, and they all have. And it's one of those moments that for me is a little bit like watching this little autistic boy walk into a mall and it sounds like sirens are going off. I never had that. No one ever tried to discourage me. And that's odd. It's hard to hear, especially because we're not even talking about right now. The conversation really isn't about whether women should be in ministry. The conversation is, how should we treat you when you are in ministry? That's what this conversation around commissioning, ordination, conference leadership, all of that sort of thing kind of seems to center around. Let me ask you a couple of other questions now. So are any of you, how many of you are commissioned? Okay, so Susan is commissioned. How many of you are ordained?
As an elder.
Okay, ordained as an elder. That's an interesting thing because the Bible doesn't really draw distinctions between elders and pastors with regard to ordination in ways that are easy to appreciate. So we won't get too sidetracked there. But let me ask this. Commissioning versus ordination, this seems to be the issue at hand. What's the difference to you? When I ask you, what do you perceive to be the difference here?
Okay, I'm holding the mic, so I'll start. And I said this caveat in the beginning of last service, and I want to say it now. I'm apprehensive to talk out loud about some things that I feel very deeply about. For one thing, I talk a lot, but I hold my personal cards very close to me. And I just because I think a lot about stuff, I don't really believe that everyone else has to hear what I think about. But moreover, the first class I ever took in graduate school for ministry was by Dr. John Youngberg. And he said something so precious and profound that I've never forgotten it. And it has been my mainstay of my attempt in ministry. And that was, at all costs, your fundamental job is to affirm the faith in somebody. I don't want to discourage you. I don't want to make you feel bad. I'll deal with my issues, but I don't want them to ever come in the way of you. And that was the first thought I thought when you said, let's have this panel discussion. You can get up and talk about what you think about the ordination versus commissioning, all that stuff. And I'm thinking, if I say stuff, somebody's going to feel bad, and it may discourage them. So let me put that out there. Whatever I say here today, don't let it discourage you, because I'd be heartsick. It would be antithetical to what I want to do. Having said all that, the problem here for me is, personally, what I think about when I'm home by myself, is the distinction is not one of the call to ministry, the ability to minister. There's no Christian, biblical, theistic part of it. It's completely removed from that. It's a sexist issue. It's about who gets to lead and who doesn't. It is a male headship idea. It's an inequality idea. I don't let it stop me, obviously, and I'm not too worried about me because I'm getting so old. No, I'm not really old. It's in the head, right? It's in the heart. I've been at this so long that if they try to fire me, well, I'll go somewhere else. I'll do it. I'm fine. But I know that it's about men and women and an inequality there. Who's going to be in charge? And the upshot is men can be in charge, but women cannot be in charge of a man. And so we've got to draw this line. What a ridiculous criteria for running the body of Christ.
Now, of course, I'm stricken with the irony of you getting fired by Dr. Andrea Luxton.
Well, okay, she won't.
Right, but
She won't.
no,
She's
but
cool.
but interesting point though. Some don't understand. Some of you may not realize that while it's not the case now here at Andrews University, there are areas of our church structure that you must be ordained to fill roles of leadership. And so we are saying women are disqualified to lead the church in those ways. So that's an interesting point. Can we make a commitment to Susan, by the way, because I feel her pain and she shared this. Can we commit that as these women share from their hearts, we will allow ourselves to be drawn closer rather than get a foot further away? Because what we really need, what we can't have, is for these women to go about this battle alone. We've got to understand and be a part of this conversation. So I just feel like we can trust each other that as we bear our hearts here, that you won't flee from this conversation disgusted with the church. You will draw into this conversation because of your love for these women. So thank you for making that commitment to them. You were going to say something, Sam, I think.
I think when it comes to the difference between being commissioned and being ordained, I hear a lot that it's exactly the same thing. But it's hard for me to believe that because when I had graduated from PUC, my first year of pastoral ministry, I'm from one of those renegade conferences. I'm from Southeastern California. And for the first time, a woman had been nominated to be considered as president of the conference. And I remember sitting there as a delegate and watching a broadcast from our GC president begging us not to do that because only men could be ordained and only ordained ministers could be conference presidents. And I remember just all the conversation that happened there and thinking that my president now, Sandra Roberts, who is godly, she is gifted, she is spirit-filled, whenever she talks about any of this, she is so gracious and so kind, but she's so gifted for that role that she can't do it because of her gender. And then when our conference did carry through that vote, looking onto the GC Adventist yearbook, and there's a blank next to president of our conference. We're presidentless. She's a visitor when she goes as a delegate. And so it's hard for me to believe
Just pause there for a second, because here's what I'm hearing you say. What our church organization has decided to do is leave it as if for any visitor that would go to look at who works in your conference, that conference does not have a president, right?
Yes, yeah. Yes. So it's a little strange to hear but it's the same thing, separate but equal, when there are functional roles that are not recognized, even if God has gifted in that capacity.
Right. So let's take this a step further, because even here in our own community, I watched it through the text last weekend. Some are of this opinion that this conversation really comes down to the fact that women are grasping for power. And so what do you think, or how do you feel when somebody says, why can't you women just leave this alone? Why do you have to have this?
For me, this speaks to an issue of making me have to defend myself. And nobody likes to have to defend themselves. You put people in a corner and you make it required that either they look remiss or problematic, or they have to come to their own defense. It's an uncomfortable place to be. So one of the issues here for me is that simply by this differentiation of title and abilities to do certain things, you have already made half of the church have to come to their defense. That is women, or more than half, because more women. By the way, I preached in Rome this summer. It was so sweet. Me, Paul, and Peter, some of the greats. The church is struggling in Europe. I was just kidding. Well, Peter and Paul are okay. The church there is struggling, and it's women who are picking up the slack. And the church, all the leadership there were women. We are pushing away the people that are willing to do the gospel work. Or defend themselves as to why, I can do it. I'll tell the story. I'll preach. I'll look at the scripture.
It's fascinating, isn't it, what happens when our need comes face to face with some of these things. Yeah. My first church that I worked in, I was interning, and I came into this 2-church district, and the smaller of the 2 churches had 8 that were regularly attending, 8 individuals, and their head elder was a woman. And as I entered in that church district, some folks were anxious to make sure I knew that she was the head elder because there was no one else. And as I witnessed her ministry, I came to realize she was a head elder because that's who God had set aside. And she was powerful in that church, and it's just so offensive to consider that way. But amazing what we're willing to do when we have to. Interesting.
It was like 30 years ago when I started being a minister. And I was kind of in that mentality myself. I'm in Michigan. There is no way that I will ever be hired by the church. But God called me. And he gave me a ministry that is like what John Youngberg said, being able to affirm people's faith and speak to them about being spiritually formed. I didn't have to mess with church administration. I can be outcast too. But God called me. And I feel like Susan. This is an issue that we shouldn't even be talking about. But if you haven't got the ordination or the commission, you still can serve and be his priest.
So let me ask you this question. I give you a magic wand, and you can just wave it at this conversation in our church. What would happen?
My magic wand would be that Jesus would show up.
Yes.
And he'd get it fixed very quickly.
What if he is showing up?
He is. He's always here. We live in his presence.
So I'm not letting you off the hook, Susan.
Okay, that Jesus would show up and we'd all listen.
I think for me, because you already took the Jesus showing up one.
Yeah, she said Jesus. There's nothing left.
There you go.
He's always the answer.
I think for me, when it comes to this whole ordination, commissioning, shenanigans, I think if there was one thing, it is shenanigans. This is craziness.
Yeah.
I think if there was something that I would change, would just be to go back to the New Testament model of recognizing the Holy Spirit's gifts in people and empowering them to live that out, whatever that looks like. Because what I feel like people forget when it comes to this conversation is that it's not easy to be a pastor. The local church, working in the local church is hard. It's sacrifice, it's pain, it's work. And it's work that God empowers you to do. And so I think sometimes, God, if you don't want me to do this, that's totally okay. I'm doing this out of, submission and servitude to you. But it doesn't help when you have to fight other people to do what God has called you to do. That's
Right.
really hard when you have to consciously not just do what God has called you to do, which is difficult, but also have to spend energy fighting something that's not necessary.
Right.
So if we could just, if our church could just recognize God's gifts in people and empower them to do that, that would be amazing.
So, as we conclude this, part of what I hear you all saying is you wish this were not an issue, that this is not about you spotting something that you'd like to grasp, that it would be a lot easier if this was not a fight at all. And one of our deep concerns is that in this world that is interested in questions about how people are treated and who thinks they're superior and who's placing somebody to be an inferior, it would be wonderful if people could look to the church. And this is an interesting question for our time and for our day. I just want to tell you, I so deeply respect you. And partly because you're on a journey that I'm not on, that I can only imagine. And I want to commit to you, and I'd like to invite you into a commitment, not to simply just agree with me or with Sam, but that you would be a part of holding women in ministry up. That you would invest, and in those moments that are clear to you, that just because it's not you, just because it's not your experience, that you, that I, that we would step up to the plate, because it is my strong opinion that it is only when people like me, I am ordained. And that's why I laughed when you said shenanigans, because in some way, what's happening now speaks to my ordination too, and whether or not I'm called by God. And I think that people who have power ought to spend it on righteous cause. Don't leave us on this issue. Step up and join us. And as we close, as we walk off this platform here, I guess it's not really a platform, but as we walk off, if you would like to thank God for the women who minister around the world and who have been a part of your life and others and maybe sitting beside you, if you'd like to thank God for that, I invite you to just give God a Thanksgiving applause.